Chapter 7: The Church in the Process of Liberation. The Latin American Church has lived, and to a large extent continues to live, as a ghetto church. The Latin American Christian community came into being during the Counter-Reformation, and has always been characterized by its defensive attitude as regards the faith. This posture was reinforced in some cases by the hostility of the liberal and anti-clerical movements of the 19th century, and, more recently, by strong criticism from those struggling to transform the society to which the Church is so tightly linked. This hostility led the Church to seek the support of the established order and economically powerful groups in order to face its adversaries and assure for itself what it believed to be an opportunity to preach the gospel peacefully. But for some time now, we have been witnessing a great effort by the Church to rise out of this ghetto power and mentality, and to shake off the ambiguous protection provided by the beneficiaries of the unjust order which prevails on the continent. Individual Christians, small communities, and the Church as a whole are becoming more politically aware and are acquiring a greater knowledge of the current Latin American reality, especially in its root causes. The Christian community is beginning, in fact, to read politically the signs of the times in Latin America. Moreover, we have witnessed the taking of positions which could even be characterized as daring, especially compared with previous behavior. We have seen a commitment to liberation which has provoked resistance and mistrust. All this has required a task of reflection on the questions posed by this new attitude. Hence, the new theological thinking now occurring in Latin America comes more from the Christian groups committed to the liberation of their people than from the traditional centers for the teaching of theology. The fruitfulness of reflection will depend on the quality of these commitments. The process is complex, and things are changing before our very eyes. Here we focus our attention on participation in the process of liberation, and thus do not concern ourselves with other aspects of the life of the Church. It will be helpful to point out some of the highlights which characterize the new situation now being created. The commitment of Christians. The different sectors of the people of God are gradually committing themselves in different ways to the process of liberation. They are becoming aware that this liberation implies a break with the status quo, that it calls for a social revolution. In relation to the entire Latin American Christian community, it must be acknowledged that the number of persons involved is small, but the numbers are growing and active, and every day they are acquiring a larger hearing both inside and outside the Church. Laypersons. What we have referred to as the pastoral approach of New Christendom brought about, among large groups of Christians, a political commitment to the creation of a more just society. In the past, the lay apostolate movements, especially among youth, have given a considerable number of their better leaders to the political parties of socio-Christian inspiration. The distinction of Plain's stage allowed for purification of the motivation of these commitments, as well as for the discovery of new perspectives for the action of Christians in the world in collaboration with persons of different points of view. Today, apostolic youth movements have radicalized their political options. It has been true for some time now that in most Latin American countries, young militants do not share the orientation of moderate renewal groups. The ever more revolutionary political options of Christian groups, especially students, workers, and peasants, have frequently been responsible for conflicts between lay apostolic movements and the hierarchy. These options have likewise caused the movement members to question their place in the Church, and have been responsible for the severe crises experienced by some of them. Moreover, many have discovered in these movements evangelical demands for an ever more resolute commitment to the oppressed peoples of this exploited continent. But the inadequacy of the theologico-pastoral plans, which until recently were considered viable by these movements, the perception of the close ties which unite the Church to the very social order which the movements wish to change, the urgent, albeit ambiguous demands of political action, the impression of dealing with the concrete in the revolutionary struggle. All these factors have caused many gradually to substitute working for the kingdom with working for the social revolutions, Or more precisely, perhaps, the lines between the two have become blurred. In the concrete, all this has often meant a commitment to revolutionary political groups. The political situation in Latin America, together with the subversion of the status quo advocated by these groups, forced them to become at least partially clandestine. Moreover, as awareness of existing legalized violence grows, the problem of counter-violence is no longer an abstract ethical concern. It now becomes very important on the level of political efficacy. Perhaps more accurately, it is on this latter level that the question of human nature is concretely considered. Under these conditions, the political activity of Christians takes on new dimensions which have caught by surprise not only the ecclesial structures, but also the most advanced pedagogical methods of the lay apostolic movements. It is clear, for example, that the kind of apostolic movements represented by the Catholic action groups among the French workers, that is, communities of Christians with different political options who meet for a revision de vie in the light of the faith, is as such not viable. Among other reasons, this is so because political radicalization tends to lead to united and impassioned positions, and because the kind of activity which develops does not allow for entirely free expression of ideas. The model of the workers' Catholic action is valid in a more or less stable society where political commitments can be lived out publicly. This model presupposes and facilitates, moreover, a theoretical dialogue with Marxism in a way which holds little interest for Latin America. On this continent, the oppressed and those who seek to identify with them face ever more resolutely a common adversary, and therefore the relationship between Marxists and Christians takes on characteristics different from those in other places. On the other hand, meetings between Christians of different confessions, but of the same political option, are becoming more frequent. This gives rise to ecumenical groups, often marginal to their respective ecclesiastical authorities, in which Christians share their faith and struggle to create a more just society. The common struggle makes the traditional ecumenical programs seem obsolete, a marriage between senior citizens, as someone has said, and impels them to look for new paths toward unity. A profound renewal or renaissance of various lay apostolic movements is nevertheless apparent. After the initial impact of a radical politicization for which they were inadequately prepared theologically, pedagogically, and spiritually, everything seems to indicate that they are beginning to find new approaches. There are also arising new kinds of groups, as well as close collaboration among existing movements. These go beyond any particular specialization, yet recognize the need for specialized pedagogies and are oriented toward a specific social milieu. The cement holding them together is that their particular posture within the Church and within the Latin American political process. A clear option in favor of the oppressed and their liberation leads to basic changes in outlook. There emerges a new vision of the fruitfulness and originality of Christianity and the Christian community's role in this liberation. This is not a matter merely of a reaffirmation of a choice, but also of concrete experiences of how to witness to the gospel in Latin America today. But many questions remain unanswered. The new vitality that can be foreseen does not have before it a completely clear path. Priests and religious. A clearer perception of the tragic realities of the continent, the clear options which political polarization demand, the climate of more active participation in the life of the Church created by Vatican II, and the impulse provided by the Latin American Bishops' Conference in Medellin. All these factors have made priests and religious today one of the most dynamic and restless groups in the Latin American Church. Priests and religious, in ever-increasing proportions, seek to participate more actively in the pastoral decisions of the Church. But, above all, they want the Church to break its ties with an unjust order, and they want it, with renewed fidelity to the Lord who calls it and to the gospel which it preaches, to cast its lot with those who suffer from misery and deprivation. In a considerable number of countries, we observe the creation of groups of priests with characteristics not foreseen by canon law, who have organized to channel and reinforce their growing concern. These groups are characterized by their determination to commit themselves to the process of liberation and by their desire for radical change both in the present internal structures of the Latin American Church as well as in the manner in which the Church is present and active on this continent of revolution. These concerns, as well as other factors, have led in many cases to friction with local bishops and apostolic nuncios. We can say that unless deep changes take place, this conflictual situation will spread and become more serious in the immediate future. Moreover, there are many priests who consider it a duty to adopt clear and committed personal positions in the political arena. Some participate actively in politics, often in connection with revolutionary groups. As a matter of fact, this participation is not essentially something new. In many ways, the clergy has played and still plays a direct participation in political life, barely veiled in some cases under pretexts of a religious nature. The new dimension is that many priests clearly admit the need and obligation to make such a commitment, and above all, that their options, in one way or another, place them in a relationship of subversion regarding the existing social order. There are other factors. For example, the effects of a certain weariness caused by the intensity of the resistance that must be overcome within the Church. And then there is the disenchantment caused by the apparent futility of work regarded as purely religious, which has little contact with the reality and social demands of the continent. We are facing an identity crisis. For some, this means a reassessment of the current lifestyle of the clergy, and for others it means even a reevaluation of the meaning of the priesthood itself. On the other hand, the numbers are growing of those who have found a renewed meaning for their priesthood or religious life in the commitment to the oppressed and their struggle for liberation. For them, the gospel, the word of the Lord, the message of love, is a liberating force which attacks the roots of all injustice. This leads them to put in second place the questions now being debated with different priorities in other parts of the world, regarding the priestly or religious life. Frequently in Latin America today, certain priests are considered subversive. Many are under surveillance or are being sought by the police. Others are in prison and have been expelled from their country. Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia, and the Dominican Republic are significant examples, or have been murdered by terrorist anti-communist groups. For the defenders of the status quo, priestly subversion is surprising. They are not used to it. The political activity of some leftist groups, we might say, within certain limits, assimilated and tolerated by the system and is even useful to it to justify some of its repressive measures. The dissidence of priests and religious, however, appears as particularly dangerous, especially if we consider the role which they have traditionally played. Bishops. The new and serious problems which face the Latin American Church and which shape the conflictual and changing reality find many bishops ill-prepared for their function. There is among them, nevertheless, an awakening to the social dimension of the presence of the Church and a corresponding rediscovery of its prophetic mission. The bishops of the most poverty-stricken and exploited areas are the ones who have denounced most energetically the injustices they witness. But in exposing the deep causes of these injustices, they have had to confront the great economic and political forces of their countries. They naturally leave themselves open to being accused of meddling in affairs outside their competence, and even of being friendly to Marxist ideas. Often this accusation is made, and vigorously, in conservative sectors, both Catholic and non-Catholic. Some of these bishops have become almost political personalities in their respective countries. The consequence has been tightened police vigilance and in some cases death threats on the part of groups of the extreme right. But it is not just a question of isolated personalities. It is often entire conferences of bishops who openly take a position in this arena. We should also mention the efforts of many bishops to make changes of varying degrees of radicalness in church structures. The results are still much below what is desired and necessary. The first steps do appear to have been taken, but the danger of retreat has not been eliminated, and above all, there is much yet to be done. In the majority of cases, options at the episcopal level regarding social transformation have been expressed in written statements, but there have also been cases in which these declarations have been accompanied by very concrete actions: direct intervention in workers' strikes, participation in public demonstrations, and so forth. Statements and attempts at reflection. From these commitments on which we have commented briefly, there have emerged statements explaining them and outlining a theologico-pastoral reflection upon them. During the past 3 years, there have appeared a great number of public statements by lay movements, groups of priests and bishops, or national conferences of bishops. As regards doctrinal authority and impact, the most important text we will mention is, of course, that of the Episcopal Conference at Medellin, 1968. To a certain extent, the others can be ordered around it. But without these others, it would not be possible to grasp accurately the process which led to Medellin or the repercussions flowing from it. These other statements go beyond Medellin. Their options are clearer and less easily neutralized by the system. They are also closer to concrete commitments. Moreover, these statements express the sentiments of large sectors of the people of God. It is a somewhat muffled voice which still does not actually arise from the oppressed, condemned as they have been to a long silence except through many filters. It is, however, a first attempt at speaking out. From the point of view of the issues being discussed here, we can classify these texts into two necessarily related themes: the transformation of the Latin American reality and the search for new forms of the Church's presence on the contemporary scene. Towards the transformation of the Latin American reality. One unifying theme which is present throughout these documents, and which reflects a general attitude of the Church, is the acknowledgement of the solidarity of the Church with the Latin American reality. The Church avoids placing itself above this reality, but rather attempts to assume its responsibility for the injustice which it has supported, both by its links with the established order, as well as by its silence regarding the evils this order implies. We recognize that we Christians, for want of fidelity to the gospel, have contributed to the present unjust situation throughout our words and attitudes, our silence and inaction, claim the Peruvian bishops. More than 200 laypersons, priests, and bishops of El Salvador assert that our Church has not been effective in liberating and bettering the Salvadoran. This failure is due in part to the above-mentioned incomplete concept of human salvation and the mission of the Church, and in part to the fear of losing privileges or suffering persecution. As for the bishops' vision of reality, they describe the misery and the exploitation in Latin America as a situation of injustice that can be called institutionalized violence. It is responsible for the death of thousands of innocent victims. This view allows for a study of the complex problems of counter-violence without falling into the pitfalls of a double standard, which assumes that violence is acceptable when the oppressor uses it to maintain order, and is bad when the oppressed invoke it to change this order. Institutionalized violence violates fundamental rights so patently that the Latin American bishops warned that one should not abuse the patience of a people that for years has borne a situation that would not be acceptable to anyone with any degree of awareness of human rights. An important part of the Latin American clergy request, moreover, that, in considering the problem of violence in Latin America, let us by all means avoid equating the unjust violence of the oppressors who maintain this despicable system with the just violence of the oppressed, who feel obligated to use it to achieve their liberation. Theologically, this situation of injustice and oppression is characterized as a sinful situation because, where this social peace does not exist, there we will find social, political, economic, and cultural inequalities. There we will find the rejection of the peace of the Lord, and a rejection of the Lord himself. With this in mind, an important group of priests declared, We feel we have a right and a duty to condemn unfair wages, exploitation, and starvation tactics as clear indications of sin and evil. The reality so described is perceived ever more clearly as resulting from a situation of dependence, in which the centers of decision making are to be found outside the continent. It follows that the Latin American countries are being kept in a condition of neocolonialism. It has been asserted that underdevelopment can be understood only in terms of the dependency relationship with the developed world that it results from. In large measure, the underdevelopment of Latin America is a byproduct of capitalist development in the West. The interpretation of Latin American reality in terms of dependency is adopted and considered valid insofar as it allows us to seek a causal explanation, to denounce domination, and to struggle to overcome it with a commitment to liberation which will produce a new society. This perspective is also clearly adopted by a seminar on the problems of youth sponsored by the Education Department of the Latin American Episcopal Council. It stresses that Latin American dependency is not only economic and political, but also cultural. Indeed, in texts of the Latin American Church of varying origins and degrees of authority, in the last few years, there has been a significant, although perhaps not completely coherent, replacement of the theme of development by the theme of liberation. Both the term and the idea express the aspirations to be free from a situation of dependence. The message of the bishops of the Third World states that an irresistible impulse drives these people on to better themselves and to free themselves from the forces of oppression. In the words of 120 Bolivian priests, we observe in our people a desire for liberation and a movement of struggle for justice, not only to obtain a better standard of living, but also to be able to participate in the socio-economic resources and the decision-making process of the country. The deeper meaning of these expressions is the insistence on the need for the oppressed peoples of Latin America to control their own destiny. Quoting Populorum Progressio, Medellin advocates, therefore, a liberating education. The bishops see this as the key instrument for liberating the masses from all servitude and for causing them to ascend from less human to more human conditions, bearing in mind that humanity is responsible for and the principal author of its successes or failure. Moreover, liberation from this servitude is considered in an important passage of Medellin as a manifestation of liberation from sin made possible by Christ. It is the same God who, in the fullness of time, sends his Son in the flesh so that he might come to liberate all persons from the slavery to which sin has subjected them. Hunger, misery, oppression, and ignorance. In a word, that injustice and hatred which have their origin in human selfishness. The Church wishes to share in this aspiration of the Latin American peoples. The bishops at Medellin think of themselves as belonging to a people who are beginning to discover their proper self-awareness and their task in the consort of nations. We are vitally aware of the social revolution now in progress. We identify with it. Argentinian priests and laypersons also declare their total commitment to the process of liberation. We wish to express our total commitment to the liberation of the oppressed and the working class, and to the search for a social order radically different from the present one, an order seeking to achieve justice and evangelical solidarity more adequately. Faced with the urgency of the Latin American situation, the Church denounces as insufficient those partial and limited measures which amount only to palliatives and in the long run actually consolidate an exploitative system. Therefore, superficial projects that create mirages and cause setbacks are criticized. At a deeper level, considering that the problems are rooted in the structures of capitalist society which produce a situation of dependency, it is stated that it is necessary to change the very bases of the system, for a true solution to these problems can come about only within the context of a far-reaching transformation of existent structures. Hence the criticism of developmentalism, which advocates the capitalist model as a solution, and the calls for a radicalization of reforms, which would otherwise, in the long run, serve to consolidate new forms of the capitalist system, bringing with them a new dependence less evident but not less real. Hence also the term social revolution appears more frequently into opposition to it less. For some, participation in this process of liberation means not allowing themselves to be intimidated by the accusation of being communist. On the positive side, it can even mean taking the path of socialism. A group of Colombian priests affirmed, "We forthrightly denounce neo-colonial capitalism, since it is incapable of solving the acute problems that confront our people. We are led to direct our efforts and actions toward the building of a socialist type of society that would allow us to eliminate all forms of man's exploitation of his fellow man, and that fits in with the historical tendencies of our time and the distinctive character of Colombians." According to the Argentinian priests for the Third World, this socialism will be a Latin American socialism that will promote the advent of the new humanity. In a speech which has been bitterly debated and attacked, one of the most influential figures of the Mexican church, Don Sergio Méndez Arqueo, asserted, "Only socialism can enable Latin America to achieve true development." I believe that a socialist system is more in accord with the Christian principles of true fellowship, justice, and peace. I do not know what kind of socialism, but this is the direction Latin America should go. For myself, I believe it should be a democratic socialism. Old prejudices, inevitable ideological elements, and also the ambivalence of the term socialism require the use of cautious language and careful distinctions. There is always the risk that statements in this regard may be interpreted differently by different readers. It is therefore important to link this subject to another which enables us, at least under one aspect, to clarify what we mean. We refer to the progressive radicalization of the debate concerning private property. The subordination of private property to the social good has been stressed often. But difficulties in reconciling justice and private ownership have led many to the conviction that private ownership of capital leads to the dichotomy of capital and labor, to the superiority of the capitalist over the laborer, to the exploitation of man by man. The history of the private ownership of the means of production makes evident the necessity of its reduction or suppression for the welfare of society. We must hence opt for social ownership of the means of production. The case of Chile is particularly interesting. The electoral victory of a socialist government poses a decisive and potentially very fruitful challenge to Chilean Christians. The first reactions are already being felt, but it is well to remember that they come out of a long tradition of participation by various groups in the struggle for liberation of the oppressed sectors. A group of priests attached to the university parish in Santiago writes, "The capitalist system exhibits a number of elements which are anti-human. Socialism, although it does not deliver humanity from injustices caused by personal attitudes or from the ambiguity inherent in all systems, does offer a fundamental equality of opportunity. Through a change in the relationships of production, it dignifies labor so that the worker, while humanizing nature, becomes more of a person. It offers a possibility for the even development of the country for the benefit of all, especially the most neglected. It asserts that the motivation of morality and social solidarity is of higher value than that of individual interest, and so forth. Human transformation emerges as a simultaneous task. All this can be implemented if together with the transformation of the economic structure, the transformation of humanity is undertaken with equal enthusiasm. We do not believe persons will automatically become less selfish, but we do maintain that where a socio-economic foundation for equality has been established, it is more possible to work realistically toward human solidarity than it is in a society torn asunder by inequity. The attitude of Christians is based on the understanding that the coming of the kingdom implies the building of a just society. If our country engages in an all-out struggle against misery, the Christian, who should participate fully in it, will interpret whatever progress is achieved as a first implementation of the kingdom proclaimed by Jesus. In other words, today the gospel of Christ implies, and is incarnated in, multiple efforts to obtain justice. The MOAC, Workers' Catholic Action Movement, has this to say regarding the victory of the new Chilean regime. This fact embodies a great hope and a great responsibility for all workers and their organizations, active and watchful collaboration to bring about a more just society which will permit the integral liberation of those oppressed by an inhuman and anti-Christian system such as capitalism. More recently, a large group of priests has taken a clear stand in favor of the socialist process occurring in Chile. Socialism, characterized by the social appropriation of the means of production, opens the path to a new economy. This economy makes possible an autonomous and more rapid development, as well as an overcoming of the division of a society into antagonistic classes. Nevertheless, socialism is not only a new economy. It should also generate new values which make possible the emergence of a society of greater solidarity and fellowship in which workers assume with dignity the role which is theirs. We feel committed to this process already underway and wish to contribute to its success. Further, they state, the profound reason for this commitment is our faith in Jesus Christ, which is deepened, renewed, and takes on flesh according to historical circumstances. To be a Christian is to be in solidarity. To be in solidarity at this time in Chile is to participate in the historical task which the people has set for itself. In a document directed to the Bishops' Synod in Rome, the Peruvian bishops stated, "When governments arise which are trying to implant more just and human societies in their countries, we propose that the Church commit itself to giving them its backing, contributing to the elimination of prejudice, recognizing the aspirations they hold, and encouraging the search for their own road toward a socialist society." Finally, the process of liberation requires the active participation of the oppressed. This certainly is one of the most important themes running through the writings of the Latin American Church. Based on the evidence of the usually frustrated aspirations of the popular classes to participate in decisions which affect all of society, the realization emerges that it is the poor who must be the protagonists of their own liberation. It is primarily up to the poor nations and the poor of the other nations to effect their own betterment. Rejecting every kind of paternalism, the ONIS priests say, "We believe that social transformation is not simply a revolution for the people, but that the people themselves, especially farmers and working men, exploited and unjustly kept in the background, must take part in their own liberation." The participation of the oppressed presupposes an awareness on their part of their unjust situation. Justice, and therefore peace, say the Latin American bishops, conquer by means of a dynamic action of awakening, conciencización, and organization of the popular sectors which are capable of pressing public officials who are often impotent in their social projects without popular support. However, existing structures block popular participation and marginate the great majorities, depriving them of channels for expression of their demands. Consequently, the Church feels compelled to address itself directly to the oppressed instead of appealing to the oppressors, calling on them to assume control of their own destiny, committing itself to support their demands, giving them an opportunity to express these demands, and even articulating them itself. At Medellin, a pastoral approach was approved which encourages and favors the efforts of the people to create and develop their own grassroots organizations for the redress and consolidation of their rights and the search for true justice. A new presence of the Church in Latin America. A call to struggle against oppressive structures and to construct a more just society would have very little impact, however, if the whole Church did not rise to the level of these demands by means of a profound revision of its presence in Latin America. A. The first evidence of this revision which can be culled from the texts mentioned is that, having acknowledged the Church's responsibility in the current situation, they strongly insist that the Church, and in particular the bishops, fulfill a role of prophetic denunciation of these grave injustices rampant in Latin America. which have already been characterized as sinful situations. The bishops at Medellin asserted, "To us, the pastors of the church, belongs the duty to denounce everything which, opposing justice, destroys peace." They are moved to make this denunciation by the duty of solidarity with the poor to which charity leads us. This solidarity means that we make ours their problems and their struggles, that we know how to speak with them. This has to be concretized in criticism of injustice and depression, and the struggle against the intolerable situation which a poor person has to tolerate. Even further, the bishops are asked to go beyond statements about situations, to concentrate on concrete events, and to take positions regarding them. The Peruvian bishops commit themselves to denounce injustice, supporting these denunciations, if necessary, by concrete gestures of solidarity with the poor and the oppressed. Aware of the difficulties which this solidarity with the poor may bring to those who practice it, the bishops assembled in Medellin declared, "We express our desire to be very close always to those who work in the self-denying apostolate with the poor, in order that they will always feel our encouragement and know that we will not listen to parties interested in distorting their work." There is likewise an awareness of the political implications of these actions and of the criticisms which arise from certain sectors. No one should be intimidated, say the Mexican bishops, by those who, apparently zealous to preserve the purity and dignity of priestly and religious activity, characterize this intervention of the Church as political. Frequently, this false zeal veils the desire to impose a law of silence, when the real need is to lend a voice to those who suffer injustice and to develop the social and political responsibility of the people of God. The denunciation of social injustices is certainly the prevailing theme in the texts of the Latin American Church. This denunciation is a manner of expressing the intention of becoming disassociated from the existing unjust order. When a system ceases to promote the common good and favors special interests, the Church must not only denounce injustice, but also break with the evil system. The denunciation of injustice implies the rejection of the use of Christianity to legitimize the established order. It likewise implies, in fact, that the Church has entered into conflict with those who wield power. And finally, it leads to acknowledging the need for the separation of church and state, because this is of primary importance in liberating the Church from temporal ties and from the image projected by its bonds with the powerful. This separation will free the Church from compromising commitments and make it more able to speak out. It will show that in order to fulfill its mission, the Church relies more on the strength of the Lord than on the strength of power. And the Church will be able to establish the only earthly ties which it should have, communion with the disinherited of our country, with their concerns and struggles. The prophetic task of the Church is both constructive and critical, and is exercised in the midst of a process of change. The prophetic task of justice demands, on the one hand, that the Church point out those elements within a revolutionary process which are truly humanizing and encourage the determined, dynamic, and creative participation of its members in this process. On the other hand, the Church must point out the dehumanizing elements also to be found in a process of change. But this function is not appropriate if the creative participation of the Christian community within the society has not already occurred. The Cuban Church is called to this twofold task within our revolution. B. A second thematic line in the texts we have examined is the urgent need for a conscientiousing evangelization. To us, the pastors of the Church, belongs the duty to educate the Christian conscience, to inspire, stimulate, and help orient all of the initiatives that contribute to the formation of man, asserted the bishops at Medellin. This awareness of being oppressed, but nevertheless of being masters of their own destiny, is nothing other than a consequence of a well-understood evangelization. As we see it, a perhaps faulty presentation of the Christian message may have given the impression that religion is indeed the opiate of the people, and we would be guilty of betraying the cause of Peru's development if we did not stress the fact that the doctrinal riches of the gospel contain a revolutionary thrust. Indeed, the God whom we know in the Bible is a liberating God, a God who destroys myths and alienations, a God who intervenes in history in order to break down the structures of injustice and who raises up prophets in order to point out the way of justice and mercy. He is the God who liberates slaves, Exodus, who causes empires to fall and raises up the oppressed. The whole climate of the gospel is a continual demand for the right of the poor to make themselves heard, to be considered preferentially by society, a demand to subordinate economic needs to those of the deprived. Was not Christ's first preaching to proclaim the liberation of the oppressed? The content of the message itself, the process of liberation in Latin America, and the demands for participation on the part of the people all determine the priority of a conscientiousing evangelization. This evangelization will free, humanize, and better man, and will be nourished by the recovery of a living faith committed to human society. The same idea appears in another important text. In Latin America today, evangelization in the context of the youth movements is closely linked to a conscientization, insofar as this is understood as an analysis of reality which has Christ as its center and which seeks the liberation of the person. At Medellin, the bishops have resolved to be certain that our preaching, liturgy, and catechesis take into account the social and community dimension of Christianity, forming men committed to world peace. Others point out that this conscientiousing evangelization is a form of service and commitment to the poorest. Evangelizing action ought to be directed preferentially to this group, not only because of the need to understand their life, but also to help them become aware of their own mission, by cooperating in their liberation and development. It is then to the oppressed that the Church should address itself, and not so much to the oppressors. Furthermore, this action will give true meaning to the Church's witness to poverty. Poverty in the Church will only be truly achieved when the Church focuses on the evangelization of the oppressed as its primary duty. C. Poverty is, indeed, one of the most frequent and pressing demands placed on the Latin American Church. Vatican II asserts that the Church ought to carry out its mission as Christ did, in poverty and under oppression. Lumen Gentium No. 8. This is not the image given by the Latin American Christian community as a whole. Rather, poverty is an area in which countersigns are rampant. Instead of talking about the Church of the poor, we must be a poor church, and we flaunt this commitment with our real estate, our rectories and other buildings, and our whole style of life. At Medellin, it was made clear that poverty expresses solidarity with the oppressed and a protest against oppression. Suggested ways of implementing this poverty in the Church are the evangelization of the poor, the denunciation of injustice, a simple lifestyle, a spirit of service, and freedom from temporal ties, intrigue, or ambiguous prestige. D. The demands placed on the Church by prophetic denunciation, by the conscientizing evangelization of the oppressed, and by poverty sharply reveal the inadequacy of the structures of the Church for the world in which it lives. These structures appear obsolete and lacking in dynamism before the new and serious challenges. The very structures in which we operate, says a group of Bolivian priests, often prevent us from acting in a manner that accords with the gospel. This too deeply concerns us, for we see that it greatly complicates the chances of bringing the gospel to the people. The Church cannot be a prophet in our day if she herself is not turned to Christ. She does not have the right to talk against others when she herself is a cause of scandal in her interpersonal relations and her internal structures. There arises, therefore, the urgent need for a profound renewal of the present ecclesial structures. It is the opinion of lay movement representatives that pastoral structures are insufficient and inadequate. The overall pastoral structure must be reworked if it is to be adequate to the sociological situation in which it is to be carried out. This has been the sense of the seminal effort at Medellin. Its implementation is urgent. E. The profound changes in Latin America today necessarily affect the priest in his ministry and in his lifestyle, assert the Latin American bishops. The need to change the current lifestyle of the clergy is to be considered in this light, especially regarding its commitment to the creation of a new society. Although the denunciation of injustice has political overtones, it is first of all a fundamental demand of the gospel, since it concerns, according to a group of Argentinian priests, the great option of human beings for their rights, their freedom, and their personal dignity as offspring of God. Moreover, we feel that if we did not denounce injustice, we would be responsible for and accessory to the injustices being committed. The exercise of our ministry inevitably leads us to commitment and solidarity. There is the need for change also with regard to ways of earning a living. New ways must be found to support the clergy. Those who do not wish to live on stipends or from teaching religion should be allowed to experiment. A secular job could be very healthy. They would find themselves in the real human world. Presbyterorum Ordinis, number 8. It would lessen the temptation to servility on the part of those who depend totally on the clerical institution. It would likewise diminish the financial problems of the institutional church. It would give a great deal more independence from the government and the armed forces. And finally, it would contribute in many of us to the development of a strong apostolic vocation disengaged from all unhealthy ties. Changes are also urged regarding greater participation of laypersons, religious, and priests in the pastoral decisions of the Church. The documents produced by various sectors of the Latin American Church over the last several years are especially abundant and worthy of a more complete and detailed technical analysis. We have recorded here only the most representative texts which fall within the scope of this work. The issues discussed are markedly different from those being dealt with up to a short time ago. Moreover, in the approach to the problems, there is apparent a growing radicalization. Although there is still a long road ahead, positions are being taken which are no longer so ambiguous or naive. There is a new attitude, ever more lucid and demanding, suggestive of a qualitatively different society and of basically new forms of the Church's presence in it.